Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to our lecture this evening, the Galloway Hoard Inscriptions. It's wonderful to welcome you to Kirkcudbright Galleries to hear from Dr. David Parsons all about his fantastic insights into the inscriptions of the Hoard. My name's Shona Burns, and I'm the facilitator this evening. I'm an arts officer here at Kirkcudbright Galleries. A few pieces of housekeeping before I introduce our speaker. Hopefully there aren't any, but should you have any technical issues, please post about them in the Q&A, and we'll do our very best to help. This event is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube in the coming weeks, and our previous lectures are already there, and you can find links to them on our website and also on our Facebook page. However, today's lecture is all about the 6 artefacts of the Hoard which bear Anglo-Saxon inscriptions. These inscriptions raise questions about the linguistic and cultural makeup of those who buried the treasure and of the wider local population. After this fascinating lecture by Dr. David Parsons, we'll be having a little Q&A where you can post your questions to David, and feel free to post them in the chat as the event progresses. We're delighted to be joined by Dr. David Parsons. David works at the University of Wales, where he researches vernacular languages of medieval Britain, and particularly as revealed by place names. He has recently completed a monograph on some medieval sources from fascinating linguistic border zones of England and Wales. Other cultural projects include articles on the interplay of Norse, English, Gaelic, and British Northwest England, and the survival of Latin as a spoken language in post-Roman Britain, and on the evidence of place names in the medieval Church of England and Wales. We're delighted to have David join us today to tell us more about the inscriptions of the Galloway Hoard. Just to remind everyone, if you have any questions at all, please post them in the Q&A function, and I'll now pass over to David. Thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you very much, Shona. Now let's see if I can share my screen. Does that look right? Yep. Does it move? Yes. Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. I feel as if you have me at something of a disadvantage tonight, because usually when I talk to a sort of general mixed audience, as I like to think of this one, I'm introducing some aspect of the subject about which they have probably never heard or never considered for a moment. But in this particular case, the Galloway Hoard has become in the last few years such a well-known discovery. The lecture is part of a series, and I'm sure that many of you have been to previous lectures in the series. You may well have seen the Hoard itself at the exhibitions in Edinburgh or Kirkcudbright. And in short, you probably know as much, if not more, about Hoard as I do. So what I'm going to try and do is, on the one hand, give you some sort of essential background so that if you are coming to this cold, it makes a degree of sense with a bit of luck. And on the other hand, stick to what I really know about, because as Shona says, my interest is in linguistic history. I study the medieval languages of Britain, and I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm only sort of passingly related, as it were, to a historian. I've got something of a soft spot, however, for this particular part of Scotland, southwest Scotland, along with northwest England, because those two regions, especially in the Viking Age, around the period of the 9th and 10th centuries, where we're centered tonight with consideration of the Hoard, those two areas are the areas where you not only find evidence for 4 languages being spoken as local vernaculars, but 4 languages that were spoken as local vernaculars pretty much around the same time, probably by communities who were bumping up against each other in one way or another. The 4 languages, of course, revealed by place names, revealed to a certain extent selectively by inscriptions revealed by the names of people as well as those of places, are the Germanic languages of Anglo-Saxon England, which became English, Old Norse, the language of the Scandinavians, the Vikings, coming across and moving into areas that had long been settled by Brittonic Celtic speakers of the language that developed and remains today in as Welsh in Wales, and was also spoken, of course, in Cornwall and in Cumbria, and in this part of Scotland, and to a relatively late date, and then Gaelic or Goidelic, the Irish language that was widely spoken across much of Scotland in the Middle Ages, and was probably just about reaching the Galloway area around the time, perhaps slightly after the time of this hoard. So that's my background for being interested in the area. And then, of course, a couple of years ago, when I got to examine these inscriptions, I became extremely interested in the hoard itself and this particular context. There are lots of hoards, Viking Age hoards, known from Britain and Ireland, generally interpreted as people burying their valuables to keep them safe during turbulent times, whether their valuables are sort of are loot taken from their rightful owners, or whether indeed they are the rightful owners and they're burying them for safety with the view to come back to them in the future. That would be the normal interpretation, although, as I say, I'm not an archaeologist. I don't make it my business to think too hard about hoards. I never used to before the Galloway hoard turned up. Some hoards are very small. Some of the finds on this map from northwest England are single finds of the same kind of metalwork, but others are huge and elaborate. The Quairdale hoard from Lancashire, illustrated here, full of silver and coins. In particular, this is Viking Age wealth on a grand scale. The Galloway hoard is notable for being both rich and remarkably varied as well in its contents, as we shall see, and as others have no doubt explained to you in this series. It's also relatively unusual in being on the Scottish side of the modern border. There aren't so many Viking Age hoards up here, and it's very unusual in containing a group of inscribed objects. Not only that, it's a group of inscribed objects which, as we shall see, may remarkably relate to the circumstances of the hoard's deposition itself. Before we get into that, just by way of contrast, here is one of the very few other inscriptions found in the context of a Viking Age hoard in Britain. This is an Irish type of brooch, penannular brooch, from a hoard found near Penrith in Cumberland. And this object is inscribed on the back with a Scandinavian runic futhark or alphabet. More on that in due course. The object and its inscription emphasize the sort of Irish Scandinavian associations of the artifact, as does most of the Viking Age silver around the Irish Sea coastlands. But is probably a sort of coincidental inscription. It's an object that happens to be inscribed with a demonstration of literacy. Somebody who knows the alphabet in Scandinavian runic form has inscribed this before it was buried. There doesn't seem to be any particular link between the inscription and the burial, and certainly of the thousands and thousands of items of metalwork that have been found in hoards in Britain, a tiny handful bear inscriptions. It doesn't look like a normal part of the procedure of burying your silver. So that makes the Galloway hoard very interesting, because things appear to be rather different here. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. So to start at the basics, we still tend to call it Galloway hoard, of course, because for a long time after it was found, we weren't allowed to call it anything else, and the find spot itself was held to be something of a secret for some time. But as I'm sure you know by now, the hoard was found by a metal detectorist in September 2014, just beside this church at Balmagee by the River Dee, north of Kirkcudbright, and across Loch Ken from Crossmichael. One of the big questions, of course, for archaeological investigation of the future is whether there was a church on or near the same site in the 10th century. We have no historical record that will take us that far back. Only archaeology will reveal whether there was, whether there may have been an ecclesiastical building there at the time of the hoard's deposition. And here, for anyone who doesn't know their way around, Kirkcudbright, where we are virtually tonight, in the middle there, Balmagee, a little way to the north, between Dumfries and then Whithorn over in the west, seat of an Anglo-Saxon bishopric. We'll be coming back to Whithorn in due course. It provides important context for the region in what we're going to be talking about, I think. So the hoard had been carefully assembled and deliberately buried. It consisted of two distinct layers. At the bottom, buried deepest, there were three collections of treasures, which we shall look at further in due course. And on top of those, 10 centimeters or so of gravel had been carefully and deliberately placed, looking as if it were natural. And then on top of the gravel, there was a further collection of silver, which of course is naturally what was first discovered and which had been partially dispersed by ploughing by the time it had been discovered. It would appear that as this graphic says, it would appear that that top layer was a decoy layer to give the impression that that's all there was to the hoard, whereas the greater wealth was buried further below. As I said, the artifacts themselves and the makeup of the hoard and the complexities and the many fascinating cultural connections within the artifacts in the hoard are not my thing, and it's not for me to talk about tonight. You'll get much more in, for instance, this book by Martin Goldberg and Mary Davis, as indeed on the National Museums of Scotland website, and all kinds of outlets by now will describe many of the interesting artifacts and connections of the hoard. The book also serves on its cover, and it's on the flyer for the seminar tonight, I see as well, an image of one of the key artifacts in the top layer, the decoy layer, a distinctively Anglo-Saxon pectoral cross, a cross worn around the neck by a priest, which gives a hint that there's more to this hoard than many Viking Age silver hoards, and it also gives an intriguing ecclesiastical context to the treasure, which we shall come back to. So the hoard consisted, on the one hand, of elaborate gold and silver metalwork, much of it of Anglo-Saxon manufacture, together with a range of exotic items like glass beads, rock crystal balls, all kinds of interesting bits and pieces. And on the other hand, and predominantly by volume, it's a huge collection of silver bullion, the more standard fare of Viking Age silver hoards. This bullion is predominantly in the form of two forms of ingots, lumps of silver, usually made to particular weights, weight standards, and arm rings, of which more in a moment. The arm rings, all of these things together, making up silver bullion used as the basis of a bullion economy. They're there for their silver content. They're valuable for their weight in silver rather than intrinsically as individual items. And you can tell that to a certain extent by the kind of weights and measures. All of this stuff's been carefully measured, carefully weighed in the museum, and you can see that parcels of the hoard make up particular specific weights. This is carefully measured and weighed out wealth, typical of Viking Age silver hoards. The specific arm rings, which make up a lot of the hoard, are of particular interest and importance. These are so-called Hiberno-Scandinavian broadband arm rings. It's a relatively simple ornament manufactured by hammering flat the sort of silver ingot found in the hoard. The particular style of arm ring, here mapped, distribution map of where these things have turned up, clearly focused on Ireland and the areas of Britain where we know that we have Irish Sea Viking interest and activity. And a lot of these items have come from coin dated contexts, so hoards with lots of coins in, where you can tell, where you can analyze and find out what date the hoard is likely to have been deposited. And they come from coin dated contexts between the 870s and about 930. And that, as far as I know, is still the best indicator of the date of deposition of the Galloway Hoard, around 900, in the decades around 900, because of its makeup with so many of this type of Hiberno-Scandinavian arm ring. And I'm going on about these things not because I'm an archaeologist and I do the artifacts, but because it is the arm rings that bear 5 of the 6 inscriptions in the hoard. And so they're of considerable significance to my topic tonight. Although, as you can see, even without understanding the writing in front of you, the texts are hardly literary masterpieces. They are, nonetheless, in a sense, critical to any interpretation of the hoard. And that's because, as this banner, which used to be on the National Museum of Scotland website, correctly suggests, they introduce a fascinating paradox. Although the broadband arm rings are an artifact type typical of the Irish Sea Vikings of the 9th and 10th centuries, the runic inscriptions are not of a Scandinavian type, but rather of an Anglo-Saxon variety. I'll explain how I know that in a moment in some detail. Incidentally, it's rather unfair to use this slide as an illustration because it's no longer on the national, since we've talked to them, it's no longer on the museum's website. But the entertaining thing, my screen's gone blank. The entertaining thing from the runologist's point of view, there aren't too many of us, is that actually this inscription of the 5 runic inscriptions in the Hoard, this inscription is the only one on which the runes need not be Anglo-Saxon. There are no diagnostic forms in the 3 runes there, which show you that they're Anglo-Saxon and not Scandinavian. Any of the other ones would have been a better illustration for that particular slide, but there we are. As I say, they no longer peddle that particular line on their side. So we'll come back to the question about identities and who buried the Hoard and what's going on at Balmagee, insofar as we have any idea whatsoever, in due course. But first, let me give you a sort of basic history of where I'm coming from and what we know, why we think we know it, with regards to the runic script that characterizes, say, 5 of the 6 inscriptions in the Hoard. Runes, an alphabetic script devised somewhere in northern Germany or southern Scandinavia, sometime around the time of Christ. Perhaps the earliest inscriptions, the earliest datable inscriptions found on the European continent are date to around the middle of the 2nd century AD, and it's assumed that the writing had been around for some indeterminate length of time before that. The script, the top row here is an illustration of the script at that time, in use between about the 2nd and the 6th centuries AD, broadly in northern Germany and Denmark, and then spreading into other parts of the continent and further north in Scandinavia. That script, 24, characteristically 24 letter alphabet, clearly based on a Mediterranean alphabet to the south. The forms of many of the letters, number 1, the F, number 5, the R, number 9, the H, and so on, are clearly similar to familiar Mediterranean forms for there not to be a direct relationship between the two. Many scholars would think that the most likely origin for the script is that they are a Germanic answer to the Roman lettering in use across the Roman Empire just to the south, though there have been scholars arguing for other varieties of related varieties of Mediterranean alphabet, from the Etruscan alphabet, for instance, or indeed various archaic Greek alphabets as being the source of the runes. We don't really need to get into that today. The point is that these inscriptions were being cut probably in wood, although that tends not to survive, and so we have exceptional survivals on hard materials like metal and in stone. As I say, between about the 2nd and the 6th or 7th centuries AD, a script that was devised in order to write. Some of the peculiarities of the letters are devised in order to cope with the different sounds of Germanic languages. The obvious one to draw attention to is the 3rd one in the row there, the th, or thorn, we call the runic letter, which denotes a sound that isn't found in the Latin or other Mediterranean alphabets. And so there's been a degree of innovation within the Germanic-speaking world to create an alphabet that does the job for Germanic language. And this alphabet remained in use in Germanic-speaking areas, in some Germanic-speaking areas, for several centuries, in some cases for many centuries, beyond this very early period. And in Anglo-Saxon England, we get inscriptions in the runic alphabet through until the 9th, 10th, even just about the 11th century AD. I'll say a little bit about that at the end, about the chronology of it. But certainly in the 8th and 9th centuries, that's when we see quite a lot of inscriptions in Anglo-Saxon England in the Runic alphabet. And you can see the Anglo-Saxon Runic alphabet is the middle, the second one on my slide there. And it's taken a number of developments from the early Germanic form. Most notably, it becomes longer, and there are various innovative forms. Number 4 there, the O rune, is not to be found in the Germanic row above, and so on. We could look at that in great detail, but we don't need to. It's easily summarized. And at much the same time, the 7th, 8th centuries, in Scandinavia, the rune row, the Futhark, because of the order, it tends to be called a Futhark or a Futhark. The rune row was rearranged, but in a completely opposite way. Instead of adding extra symbols for new sounds, which is essentially what happened in England, the number of symbols in use in Scandinavia was reduced. The script became a kind of shorthand. It's very clever, actually. But again, we don't need to go into that. They've reduced the number of symbols that are required in order to write the language. And the net result is that by the 8th century, by the beginning of the Viking Age, a little bit before Vikings first appeared in Lindisfarne or whatever, 793, the script in Scandinavia and the script in Anglo-Saxon England, although ultimately related and coming from the same origins, was quite different in a number of respects. And in particular, there are a good number of runic forms in use in English inscriptions. Just counting them. 17 I've circled there. Forms that are not found in contemporary Scandinavian inscriptions, which means that if you've got an inscription of any length in front of you, you can tell whether an inscription is written with the Anglo-Saxon or Scandinavian variety of runes. And that becomes very important for what we're going to look at now. So I'm going to take you through the first of the runic inscriptions found on the arm rings in the hoard. It won't take very long. The first one reads Ed, E-D, and both of those forms, as you can see, the importance of that. Ed's not going to tell us a great deal, although I do think that I do know what's going on with Ed, but I'll come back to that in a moment. The importance of it is that both the E and the D are distinctively Anglo-Saxon types. The next one, the top one in the illustration to the left there, Ber, B-E-R. And here, just the B, both the B and the R could conceivably be Scandinavian. It's would appear similar forms in both versions of the alphabet, but the E gives the game away as a distinctively Anglo-Saxon form. Till, as I said, is actually the one that was chosen to illustrate the point before. Actually, that's the one that's not got diagnostic forms. The T, the I, and the L could all look like that, whether they were Scandinavian or Anglo-Saxon type of runes. But obviously, by association, those runes are going to be Anglo-Saxon, I would have thought, given the clearly Anglo-Saxon nature of all of the others on very similar types of, in a very similar context here. And the clincher, because we have some clear context as well as some clear content, as well as the nature of the letters, is this inscription, which reads Egbrecht, in which I've just underlined here. I've stopped using arrows. I've underlined the E, the G, the E, the C are distinctively Anglo-Saxon forms. This is my favorite inscription in various respects from this hoard, because it's easiest to understand and because it's got a nice little feature at the end here. So E, G, G, B, R, E, C, and then the end of the object was coming too quickly into view, and so the T is a little superscript at the end there because he was trying to fit it in. And that actually shows that this inscription was incised on this piece of silver before the piece of silver was hacked, because this is the only inscribed arm ring that is on a hacked object. And it shows that the inscription was added after the hacking had been done, because that T is avoiding the edge at the end, which is rather nice. Now, Egbrecht is a readily understandable form. It's an Anglo-Saxon personal name, a very common personal name in the form Edgebeocht, standard Old English. Edgebrecht or Edgebecht would be the more northerly Anglian dialect form in Old English, and surviving or reintroduced, I think, to some extent, in the sort of historical form as Egbert in later usage. And given that clue, I suspect that what's going on with the other inscriptions that we've already seen is that they also relate to Anglo-Saxon personal names. In particular, till is an adjective that means, in Old English, could be an adjective meaning good, but actually it's very unusual. It's a good in itself would be a strange thing just to make an inscription of. And be till as an adjective is not a common Old English word by any means, but it is a common first element in personal names, tilla, tille, tilbecht, and so on, listed there. Same sort of thing, or indeed to a greater extent with ed. Lexically could be Old English ead, riches, prosperity, not a common word, but an extremely common first element in personal names. Edgar, Ednorth, Edward, and so on. And I think that these are forms of or abbreviations for personal names. And the third one, bear, would also bear that interpretation, although I'm much less clear as to what element that represents, or indeed what language that comes from. That could be, as well as being an Old English Berrowold or Berditch or something, could be an Old Norse Bergulfur or even a Bjorn, which tends, that diphthong tends to come into English as an E. So that particular name could conceivably be a Scandinavian one, if I'm right that it's a name, though I suspect that probably, again, in the context of all these other names, which would appear to be distinctively Old English, that it's probably more likely to be an Old English name than a Scandinavian one. That leaves one inscription, which I'm going to jump over very quickly, because although it's the longest one, it is utterly and completely baffling, which is nice, but I can't really solve it. It's difficult to illustrate. That's the best photograph of it that I've got, and it doesn't actually quite show it all, because the inscription, that's actually the same inscription bent round at the top, the same ring at the top there, bent round. And so the inscription carries around the bend, and so I haven't got a single photograph that shows all of it. I've got this, which is horrible to look at, but actually microscopic photography of the individual letters allows me to put it together. The overall effect isn't very pretty, but I can see what all the letters are. And they come out transcribed something like, this is enough. But I'm not entirely sure. The black underlinings, I wouldn't claim to be certain of the transliteration. I'm not sure that those runes are intended with those values, or with whatever value a crossed I is. But again, the importance of it, well, there's two importances. One is that the red underlined letters there are distinctly Anglo-Saxon, so we're in the same ballpark as the other inscribed objects that we've looked at so far. And we've got an inscription that would appear not to be Old English, it's not Old Norse, it's not British, and it's not Irish or Gaelic in any straightforward way. at least. It is a real puzzle. I've run it past specialists in various other languages, people who know some of the key languages better than I do, and we can't find a solution to that. It's a puzzle. Don't know what's going on with that one. Anyway, so those are the 5 runic inscriptions in the hoard. There's a little bit more to say about them before I move on. 4 of them, all apart from Egbert, came from the silver bullion collection in the lower layer of the hoard. And they have attracted considerable attention, as you may know, if you've done your reading and seen what's already been published on the hoard, because Martin Goldberg was particularly hot and first to this in recognizing that within that lower parcel of bullion there are groups of arm rings that seem to be marked as belonging to one another, as forming groups. And the key here, as you can see if you can read the text at the bottom of the slide, is the shape of the arm rings. A lot of these arm rings, say they're silver bullion, they're not arm rings, they haven't been bent to be worn as arm rings, as kind of bracelets. A lot of them are new. They've been, some of them are plain. Others, although decorated, they've not been bent to be worn. In the top left there, you've got a group that are completely flat. In the top right, you've got a group that are flat with a tight bend at one end. The bottom right, you've got a group that have a tight bend at both ends. And then you have a group in the bottom left where you've got more of a kind of fold over, which is rather distinct from that tight bend. And the beauty of this, as Martin noticed, is that one of each of those groups bears an inscription. So the flat ones are till, the top right are ed, the bottom right are bear, and then the unintelligible inscription accompanies the folded in group at the bottom left. In context, even without having any idea what the inscriptions might indicate, they look as if they could be labels associating somebody, and certainly once we start thinking these might be short for personal names, labels associating the owners, presumably, the claimed owners of these different groups of metalwork. It's a really nice idea. It's got 2 obvious obstacles, one of which is that unintelligible inscription. If each of those is a label for a personal name, well, what is that? This is here. That doesn't seem to mean anything, and certainly isn't a straightforward personal name in any language. It's too, yeah, the structure and the length of it, it doesn't look as if it's going to be a personal name at all. So that one's anomalous, which makes it a little bit awkward. And the other thing that's very, very interesting is that, of course, the intelligible Egbert inscription isn't one of these. It was found in the plough soil at the top, so it therefore belongs presumably to the upper deposit, and it therefore, it's the same kind of runes. It links with these, but does Egbert claim everything that was in the top layer, or it's not a neat pattern? It's not as neat a pattern as it looked as if it might be when the suggestion was first made. But it's certainly a very intriguing, thought-provoking pattern. So English runes, English personal names, the English indications of the inscriptions sort of urge us to return to the Anglo-Saxon context of much of the hoard beyond the silver bullion, and these are all distinctively Anglo-Saxon forms of metalwork found within the hoard. And we have a further inscription to consider, which points us once again in a similar direction. One of the items in the lower layer of the hoard was this silver gilt vessel of exotic workmanship, now thought to be possibly from Central Asia, not from Anglo-Saxon England at all, but inside were packed a lot of the artifacts that you've seen. And one of them has recently come out of conservation, had to be sort of excavated from within the pot, and turns out to be this extraordinary rock crystal, which has been made into a jar and mounted with elaborate gold filigree work. And on the base of the jar, it turned out that there was the hoard's 6th inscription. There it is, difficult to read, still difficult to read, but we've given you a bit of help by a sort of X-ray view of it here, and then a drawing. It appears to say, and now we're in Roman script, not runes, Hugwald ep fac jus, which is plausibly interpreted as Bishop Hugwald Episcopus, ordered this to be made. Facere jusit, probably. There are different views on how exactly the Latin should be expanded, but the terminology is fairly clear, and there are certain parallels, notably this one, although it's not Latin. This is a good parallel both for the type of metalwork, the gold filigree and so on, and also the sentiment. Alfred mech hecht werken, Alfred commanded me to be made, on the famous Alfred jewel in the Ashmolean Museum. It's the closest parallel in terms of an inscription for the Latin version here that we have. Bishop Hugwald, otherwise unknown. There is a Bishop Hugbald from Lindisfarne, a century earlier than the hoard, which is an interesting coincidence. Could this be a mistake? Could this be a spelling mistake on a very high status object for a Bishop Hugbald? Or could this be a bishop who we otherwise don't know of? We have a Bishop Rick nearby at Whithorn, which disappears from the historical record early in the 9th century, but appears to keep going in various ways later. Was this a later bishop of Whithorn? Or indeed, is it a bishop of somewhere else that we do not know of? All of these things are possible. So there we are, there are our 6 inscriptions, and just very briefly, I'm going to give you some Anglo-Saxon context for inscriptions and the cultural context of what's going on here. They're not the only inscriptions known from this part of the world by Anglo-Saxons. In the pre-Viking age, there's a range of texts here from Ardwall Isle by the Gatehouse of Fleet, a pre-Viking ecclesiastical site with this memorial again in Roman script to an Anglo-Saxon called Cuthgar. To the east, the most famous of Anglo-Saxon rune inscribed monuments, which in some ways I should have started the talk, no doubt, at Ruthul, the Ruthul Cross, an 8th century carved stone cross, one of the wonders of Northumbria's Golden Age, extensive runic texts recording a striking Old English literary poem on the crucifixion. And at Whithorn, the bishopric in the west, we have fragmentary runic inscription here. Just pray for Witu, pray for somebody from there, probably from the 8th century, probably pre-Viking age. The interesting thing that happens at Whithorn, however, is that we have these later stones. These are 10th or 11th century stones inscribed with distinctively Anglo-Saxon runes, just like the runes in the Hoard. This is remarkable because across most of England, the runic script disappears during the 9th century, pretty much as the Vikings arrive in the east and the north of the country. And so Whitthorn offers a rare example of the script's continued usage to 900 or indeed possibly beyond, which actually forms part of an argument, could form part of an argument, that whoever Egbert and his friends were, and whatever they were doing in being involved with the burying of this this Viking treasure in the early 10th century, they may have had local affiliations, because the use of runes around the year 900, distinctively Anglo-Saxon runes around the year 900, is more at home, arguably, in the Whitthorn area than it is in other parts of Anglo-Saxon England. And I will leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, David. That was so interesting. I have the objects behind me here, so I was trying to investigate that one that you said you couldn't figure out to see if I could do it. But we've had a few questions coming in. So if you've got any more questions, anybody, just please send them in and I'll pose them to David. But the first one that I wanted to ask you was about that mystery rune. Yeah. Someone asked, has it been tried written backwards or upside down? As I think you said it was in a ring or a circle.
It's been better. Yeah, certainly I've read it in both directions. It's not very long. It's not complicated. Yes, I can't see. I've had suggestions that it might be written in a kind of code. Anglo-Saxons are actually quite fond. Anglo-Saxon monks writing manuscripts are quite fond of kind of doing vowel substitution codes and that sort of thing. And so possibly something like that. One of the problems with trying to interpret it at all is that, as I noted, 3 of the characters, one character that's repeated, and then 2 of the characters, one of them repeated. I'm not actually entirely sure how to transliterate them. So that gives room for doubt about exactly what it is we're trying to interpret, which is sort of a moving target when you're trying to get to the bottom of an inscription like that. And it's just weird that the others all just seem to fall into a pattern. They look like personal names, and that one just doesn't. And so, yeah, an ongoing mystery.
Yeah, I like it. What else have we got? Oh, this is a more kind of general question about runes. So when did the use of Runic die out in remote places like Iceland? What % of people understood runes?
Well, to the second part, nobody really knows, but they're very common in some parts of Scandinavia. Not actually Iceland. Iceland in the Viking Age didn't use, it's strange because colonized from mainland Scandinavia where runes were thriving, and Iceland doesn't produce Scandinavian Viking period runic inscriptions, which is odd. In parts of mainland Scandinavia, runes, they continued in use into the sort of high Middle Ages, and indeed there are kind of northerly parts of Sweden where they more or less had a continuous existence through into the 16th, 17th century. So at the same time as people were discovering Viking Age monuments and trying to read them as antiquarians and so on, they were actually able to investigate current usage at that period. So in parts of Scandinavia, arguably runic writing never died out.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I always thought it was some I don't know, mythical, magical thing that just nobody understood.
Well, yeah, no, exactly, and I could have done a whole lecture on that, and of course it gains in the kind of modern period, it gains that, but also it gains that association, but also actually some of the there are medieval Scandinavian texts which look back to the Viking Age, which imbue runic characters and writing with sort of magical properties. It's true. The actual evidence from the Viking Age that you are looking at does not appear to suggest that they're being used in mysterious and mystical ways. They're used for very practical and straightforward purposes.
Yeah.
Mostly on Christian monuments as well.
Yeah. This one is a little bit longer, but someone said, I can imagine that Dr. Parsons is in contact with other specialists from around the world, and I want to ask if he has any opinion on the research of the Heavener runestone on the border of the states of Oklahoma and Kansas in the USA. Do the runes found in this hoard have any similarities or significant differences to the runes or letters and objects in the hoard? How do specialists communicate their findings or speculations to advance knowledge in this field?
Goodness, well, that's a lot of questions. I'm not specifically familiar with that inscription. There are a number of runic finds that are known from the United States. They seem to be transplanted from by Scandinavian immigrants in modern period, for the most part, as far as we can see. I'm not sure that there are any accepted sort of medieval finds of anything runic in the United States, and certainly the rune type that would be involved there are always looking back to Scandinavia. So those differences that I was highlighting between Viking Age Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon English runes would certainly come out in anything that's been claimed as runic from the United States. They're going to be of Scandinavian type, I'm quite sure.
Yeah. Let me get another one. Someone was asking about the runes. How consistent was spelling? Was it phonetic?
Yes, more or less phonetic and reasonably consistent as a result. It's actually quite, yeah, you can, in some ways we know more about the sounds of medieval languages than we do about the sounds of early modern languages, the developing sounds of early modern languages, because once you've got a written standard, it obscures the way that words are pronounced. If you're trying to spell what you say every time you do it, then you tend to write, by writing phonetically, you give the world's future linguists more of a clue as to exactly how your language is developing. So yes, it does tend to be written phonetically, but that tends to produce fairly consistent results.
Yeah. That's really impressive. You'd think it was kind of a bit random almost, but someone says, do we know where the bishop's object was made? And there were some more questions about it. Are the letters in the central circle of the base of the rock crystal bottle?
I'm trying to picture the last one. We don't know where it's made. Beyond that, the parallels the parallels for the metalwork, insofar as they're to be found at all, because it's rather a unique object. But they're English. There's a hint actually in the form of the name that it's more likely to be Northern English than Southern English, for what that's worth, as one might expect, but nothing more precise than that. I can't quite, I don't want to put my PowerPoint up again, I don't think. I can't quite visualize the question about the lettering goes around the base of the, it goes around the squared off base of the jar, as the crystal's been turned into. Yeah.
Actually, to answer that one as well, now that I think about it, there's, I believe on the National Museums of Scotland website, there is like a 3D model of the rock crystal. So if you wanted to picture it in like actual 3D terms, we've got it.
Yeah.
We've also got one here in the
Right.
gallery with
Yeah.
a 3D one, so
Yeah.
you can have a look in that one.
Well, actually, as I said at the beginning, for following up the details of many of these artifacts, then the resources that are online and in your gallery and in the National Museum in Edinburgh and so on are very, very good indeed. There's a lot of good stuff out there to follow these things up. They're not mysterious. Well,
Yeah.
beyond the mysteries that are inherent to them.
Yeah, exactly. Beyond this mystery. Someone else has asked, have you formed an opinion on how the people who buried the hoard would identify in ethnic terms? I'm not trying to ask if they were Anglo-Saxons or Vikings, but that's also kind of what I mean. How would they have seen themselves?
Yeah, well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it, in a way, and well put as well, because of course, you know, I'm bandying around terms like Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavian and so on, and what exactly does that mean in terms of self-identification and ethnicity and so on. But I suppose, to cut to the quick, I would say that people who bear those kind of names and are writing with that kind of script are actually essentially self-identifying culturally as, well, what we would call Anglo-Saxons. What they Northumbrians, they may well have called themselves, I suspect. Yeah.
Another one about the languages. So you described 4 languages. Was Pictish ever spoken in Galloway?
Pictish is a bit of a mystery, and fortunately there is no suggestion that there was Pictish in Galloway. No, so Pictish is ascribed to the more northerly regions of Scotland. The Pictish that is evident in place names and to a certain extent in the personal names of Pictish kings and so on, is clearly a close relative, a sort of northern variant of British Celtic language that developed as Welsh further south. The Pictish that gets into a number of accounts is the Pictish found in some of the inscribed Pictish Ogham stones, which remains an uncracked code, rather like perhaps my inscription. Perhaps my inscription is a Pictish name, but there's scholarly dispute about what exactly is going on in those inscriptions, and nobody has ever satisfactorily fully explained them. But that language doesn't seem to have been a current player in the southwest of Scotland.
Yeah. Another question about the language. So it seems that runes and Latin writing was used at the same time. Can you tell who would use either, and would some use both? Was English/Scandinavian speakers only, or would those who knew Latin could write in both?
I would say that the evidence from Greater Northumbria, which is where into which the much of southwest Scotland over to Whitthorn falls, is that in Northumbria, the evidence that survives almost entirely, with the possible exception of something like these, like the Hoard, but all of the stones that I've shown and a lot of the other metalwork that's inscribed, all comes from the church. It all comes from ecclesiastical settings. That's where literacy is clearly attested. How far it spread beyond the church, I don't know. And obviously that's one of the reasons why there's such an interesting potential ecclesiastical context to what's going on here, because it could actually fit in there. And within the Northumbrian church, within the pre-Viking Northumbrian church at least, Latin and Roman script, English and Runic script, both seem to be very widely known. By quite how many people, it's impossible to say. But the easiest test is that you get a repeated formulation of memorial inscription across Northumbria, and in fact the the fragments that I showed from Whithorn look as if they share part of that inscription. And that is sometimes in English and sometimes in Latin, and it's sometimes in Roman script, and it's sometimes in Runic script. And so the one cultural memorial formula uses both alphabets, both languages, and it would seem therefore that there's no sort of simple pattern of saying that this kind of person prefers that and this kind of person prefers the other. Both seem to be available and felt appropriate for carving Christian memorial inscriptions.
Yeah. Well, with that, I think we might actually have to end tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, David. It's been a really fascinating evening. I'd also like to thank our event sponsors this evening. So that's Art Fund, Garfield Weston Foundation and Museums Galleries Scotland. Their continued support is allowing us to put on these events, and our next lecture is on May the 18th. It's a little bit different, but does touch on something that David spoke about tonight. So it's about how the replica of the Galloway Hoard vessel was created using advanced digital 3D technologies. And we're excited to be joined by Stephen Day of ThinkC 3D. Tickets for this event are still available on our Eventbrite page, and we're also hosting some events at the galleries itself, which is really exciting. On the 6th of May, we're hosting a mead tasting event with the award-winning Nidhogger Mead Company. It's set to be a really great evening, and the event is free, but registration is required, and that's also on our Eventbrite page. Also on the 21st of May, we have Cathbad the Viking, who's coming into the galleries, and he's actually helping you to make your own Viking arm ring. So you could maybe do some inscriptions as well, inspired by David. Another thank you to the behind the scenes crew here at Kirkcudbright Galleries and Dumfries and Galloway Council, as well as the National Museums of Scotland. Of course, another thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. The support for this exhibition has been really wonderful, and I look forward to welcoming you to our next event or to the exhibition when you come to visit. We'll be sending out a short survey in the next few days about this event, and the email will also include a link to our social media pages, which is a great way to keep informed of future events. But that's all from us here. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.